Hello, church. While I'm unable to be with you in person this morning because I'm traveling back east with my family for the next couple weeks, I'm happy to be able to offer this message I've prepared for you. But before we get to that, would you please join me in the spirit of prayer? God, may the words that I have prepared and the hearts that are ready to receive them all be acceptable in your sight, for you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. You know, there's an article from a few years ago about a long journey, and it was a woman and her husband who were on vacation in Germany. And they went out to an island in the North Sea. And one day, as she was walking the beach, she found a bottle that had washed ashore. Now, that's nothing really unusual about that, I suppose, but when she picked it up, she saw that there was a note inside it that told her to break open the bottle. So she did. And inside, she read a message from a man named George Parker Bidder, asking the person who found the bottle to write him in England and let him know where they found the bottle. Sounds pretty interesting. There was just one little problem. She wasn't going to be able to write a letter to George Parker Bidder because he had died in 1954. Having cast that bottle into the water as part of a larger experiment all the way back in 1906. He had been studying tidal patterns and was interested in seeing where his bottles ended up. And who would have guessed that it would have taken 116 years for the message to reach its destination? That article brings to mind another letter. That's one not from a 1906 bottle, but it's much older. The author wrote this letter not really to anyone in particular, but as a letter to followers of Christ in general. And he cast it out to the waters of the early church, much like George Parker Bidder cast his bottles, hoping for it to find readers and to inspire a response. And the only thing is that the waters weren't always that friendly for James's letter. At least it was in doubt early on that it would even become part of the Bible. And Martin Luther, at the start of the Protestant Reformation, he even argued that it should be taken out. He famously called James an epistle of straw. A lot of resistance to the letter is that James concentrates on the way that Christians act, not so much on the grace of God. And for people like Luther in particular, early Protestants who wanted people to concentrate on the grace of God, they worried how parts of James, verses like faith without works is dead, how those would be read and understood. They didn't want people believing that God's love or grace was in any way dependent on our actions. In many ways, that's an appropriate response. But there's so much in this letter that we Christians can't stand to leave just kind of floating out on the waters anymore. There's so much that modern Christians in particular need to hear. Like today's passage, for instance. James writes, "Every generous act of giving with every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights." And then he ends it, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to care for the orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world." In other words, to be a Christian is to be generous. It's to give freely of ourselves. And it's to care for the least among us, even when the world itself has turned its back. We're not asked to do these things in order to be saved or loved by God. We're asked to do these things because God already loves us. And because we're living lives of gratitude for that grace and that love. But James says that sometimes we forget that. He says that sometimes we're like people who look in the mirror and we see ourselves, but then we forget who we are the second we turn away. We lose our sense of identity that quickly. For Christians, that means that we lose our sense of what we're meant to do and who we're meant to be in this world. We hear the words while we're reading them, and we nod our heads, but we often forget them as soon as we turn away. And James tells his readers to care for the widows and orphans. In his time, when women and children had so few rights or resources, he was basically telling Christians to care for the least of these. He was saying, look out, look out for the people who have nothing else to give you, the ones who are falling through the cracks. Look out for the ones that the world has sort of thrown away. 2,000 years after James cast those words out on the waters, the message still hasn't quite made it to shore. At least not everywhere. Oh, we get it right sometimes when we think about it, but far too often Christians get it wrong. Who are the widows and the orphans of today? Who are the ones that are so disenfranchised or so forgotten, so written off, that they are at best ignored and at worst used as someone's debating point? Sometimes they are literal widows and orphans, but often they're not. They're the people who some might say, well, they brought it on themselves. They're the ones we might argue they should just try harder. They're the ones whose choices were fortunate enough to be able to, Monday morning quarterback from our places of comfort. But friends, that is not what we're called to do. That's not who we're called to be. Christians far too often are not seen as the ones who step in to care for the widows and the orphans of our time. Too often we're seen as the ones who judge, the ones who turn a blind eye, or the ones who only add to the suffering of others at its worst. And our actions are more than just what we do, because our choices become who we are. They become signals to the world of what we really believe. Because the reality is, when people look at Christians and they wonder why we come to this place every week, they don't want to know about the finer points of our theology. They want to know, what is it that you stand for? What do we stand for? And they'll figure that out by watching how we act. And that's true for all of us. That's true for us as we walk into our offices or places of employment Monday through Friday. It's true for us in our homes when we go, after here. It's true in the halls of our schools. The way we act, all of us, directly communicates to others who we really are and what we really believe. And that's especially true when it's hard or when it's unpopular. Many of you knew Josh Wilson, a church member who died a couple months ago. He used to sit kind of close to the front here every week. But you may not have known that in his early years as a minister, he traveled to Montgomery, Alabama to go to the Selma Montgomery March. And he went as a representative of his denomination, the Disciples of Christ, which is one of our partners in the United Church of Christ. But he also went as a voice for those whose voices were cast aside or ignored. And now we might hear that and look back on it and say, wow, good for him. I wish I could have been there to go to that, to tend that worthy cause. But the fact is, the end of the civil rights story hadn't been written yet when Josh traveled to Montgomery, Alabama to march with Dr. King. That was 57 years ago. At that point, no one knew how it would all end. And in many ways, we still don't. But Josh, alongside many other people of faith, decided to go to Alabama to stand as a witness to the love of Christ for all people. It wasn't enough for him to stay safely at home and point fingers or say what he believed from his couch. He had to act. And his church and his denomination, they agreed with that, and they sent him with their blessing. And friends, the days of action aren't over. There are still those who need our voices, who need our support, and they need our action. And how we respond will define who we are, and it will tell the world what we believe. And so, here's my challenge for you this week. You found this bottle on the beach that James cast into the waves many years ago. And now you've opened it and you've read the message. And now, just like that woman who found the bottle on her vacation, you have a choice. You can let the world know that you got the message, or you can just throw it back into the waves. The choice is yours. The choice is all of ours. And there's a world out there that needs not just our thoughts and our prayers, but our prayerful action. It's time to open the bottle and to respond to the word. Amen. Amen.